Okay, I've already got the fan clutch off. And next step is this bypass pipe. And I've already taken this one bolt out. And these things are prone to breaking off right here where the holes are because the threads are froze in the head. So that's just something to be concerned about. If it happens, I do have those bolts, and they also have on each side of this banjo fitting, they have a compressible aluminum seal ring that if you're going to reuse them, you want to keep track of them. That's what they look like right there. Of course, you want to clean them and make sure that they're usable. And I'm actually using a ratchet here instead of my air wrench so that I can better control removing these bolts. If they're too tight, you just kind of know from experience. If they're too tight, you actually want to tighten a little bit, then loosen, then tighten, then loosen, then tighten, and gradually work the bolt out so you don't break it. If you break it, then of course it's a real problem getting the broken piece out of the cylinder head, which means you want a specialist really to do that. Okay, I'm going to try and catch that washer. I do have more of them, but these look pretty good. I want to catch that washer, that seal ring. I'm looking for something here. Here's what I need. There we go. Okay, got it. And of course, before I reassemble, you want to wire wheel those threads. Okay. Our next step here, this hose right here we have to loosen, and I can tell that's not in good shape. Okay, now something to keep track of. I'm pulling the bolts out of here. If water comes out of that bolt hole, that means that it's not a bottom thread in the block. It goes into the coolant chamber. If coolant comes out of here, that means that when I reassemble, I'll need to wire wheel these threads and put sealant on. So that's just something to keep track of. Fortunately, I have coolant in there that's above the level of the bolts, so I'll know if that happens to be the case. Okay, also to keep track of are the bolt lengths. They may be varying lengths and you want to put them back where they belong. Okay, as a guy gets older, eyesight's not as good. I thought that on this diesel engine there was clearance to remove all the water pump housing bolts. And if not, at least a hole through the dampener to get to the bottom one. But I've just realized there's no hole through this dampener to get the very bottom bolt, which I'll point out here. Have my cameraman come around. And that bolt is right there where the end of my finger is. And as you can see, the balancer is blocking it. There is a slot in the balancer, but there's no corresponding hole in the dampener. So it's going to be a little more trouble to get to that bolt. We'll have to manually crank the crankshaft to get the slot in the balancer over here, and then the bolt, to make sure there's enough room for the bolt to come out. I'm going to test with a bolt here. And yes, we can do it. So it's just a little more trouble over on this side. And there is a slot in the balancer to give us room to access that bolt. Now I've already had my assistant hit the starter a number of times, and it won't stop in the right place. So we're going to have to put a socket on the crank bolt and turn the crank to get that in the right position to access this bolt. Now, you never turn an engine backwards. If you can't get to it and it looks like turning it backwards would work, don't do it. Make a complete or almost complete revolution. Okay, so since we're replacing what's called the water pump housing, I have found one from my stock. So you want to check around here, and this one looks good. Then also this impeller surface right here. I've seen them corrode all the way through. That looks good. Then you want to check the threads for the bypass bolt, the banjo bolt, and the threads for the water pump itself. And then this gasket surface here, which I need to buff that up, but it's good. So we've got what we need. This particular customer is opting for replacing the water pump. So we're going to film this next weekend when I have a water pump in hand. It turns out I only have a short one on the shelf, and this requires what's called a long water pump. Okay, we are going to take off the water pump housing because you can see it's so corroded. This car sat for a while, and with old antifreeze, old antifreeze gets very corrosive. And to get the bottom bolt here, I'm actually going to tip this alternator over to one side by removing this bolt back here. Now, it looks like I could just take the nut off, but that nut is actually welded to that frame. So it's kind of backwards, but this is the way I got to do it. Okay, I've got the alternator swung. It gives me just a little bit more room because this nut and bracket were in the way here. Now, to make a wrench work in there, this is still in the way. Now I can unbolt this, take it off, or I can just bend this a little bit. So, this is where it's handy to have a torch, and I got a welding tip on here, but that'll get it hot enough. The very tip of that blue flame is the hottest. Okay, that's the angle I need. And we'll cool it off quick and retain some of its strength. All right. Okay. Oh, and it's even loose. How about that? And there isn't quite, the head of the bolt is recessed, so there's not room for a ratcheting box end wrench. I'm going to have to just do slow but sure here. Now I could of course take off the dampener. That's 6 bolts that are hard to get to, and it's almost easier to take the radiator out. But this has got AC, you know, it's just going to be a little bit time consuming. Okay, to make this easier and not so back-breaking, we've jacked the car up a bit, and even though I'm not going underneath it, probably you always jack stand. Car's got to go up a little bit more and then we'll be ready. Okay, I got the bolt out a few turns. Now I actually have room to put on a swivel end ratchet end wrench on there, which makes it a lot faster. And I'm actually doing this with my gloves off because I need all the feel I can get to hold that thing on there. Here we go. Okay, I've got this bolt out of the threads of the block, but you cannot remove the bolt because the dampener is in the way. However, you just leave it in place in the housing, and the housing comes out with the bolt. There's still 2 more bolts here, which I'll rip out of there with my right angle air tool here, which is pretty handy. Okay. Now you always want to have a drain pan, and if you notice, when we jacked it up, we had the jack at quite an angle. That gives room for the drain pan to be underneath this area. So you can see how terrible this is. That was soon to fail. And it's just like failing going down that freeway on a hot day and you're not noticing the temperature gauge and you ruin your engine. So, you can see this hard to get to bolt here and why I could not get a ratchet end wrench on it to start with. And so it took a few turns with my bent wrench in order to get a ratchet on there. Okay, so we're replacing the water pump as well. So the only thing we need this for are these bolts. Okay, now this is pretty important. I grabbed one off the shelf, and this area right here is thicker than the one I took off. And I can tell by putting this in there that if I put a bolt in there, the balancer would hit the head of the bolt. So there's a reason for this being recessed. So whatever you do, don't put the wrong one on. And when this is on the car, it's pretty hard to read the casting number. And it is a different casting number. This is an 0201. The correct one is an 0501. So we got to go down to a parts car. We'll check my stock on the shelf first, but I do have a parts car. I may have to end up taking it off a parts car.